Well, howdy partners, and welcome to the Indie Roundup Rodeo. What we do here is corral up some smaller indie titles and show these little dogs off. Today we are talking about three indie games you can find and play on this here Nintendo Switch. All these three games combined still cost less than a normal AAA game, and two of them are at least worth getting. These three are a little different than the last ones we covered here before. These dark horses have been known to scare those audience members of faint heart and weak constitution. Yeah, I'm doing a spooky horror video in January. If you got a problem with that, cowpoke.
Catch me outside, how about that?
It's another night after a long day of work. You unwind by taking a bath. The house is quiet ever since you sent your daughter to that Catholic girls' school. And as soon as you start to relax, you hear a letter get slipped under the front door. It's from your daughter's school. There's been an emergency and you need to make the trek to the school immediately. The roads are cold and abandoned. You scale up the mountain to make it up to the school. The halls are dark and empty, with the exception of one other entity that seems to be haunting these halls. And it doesn't take long for the other entity to find you. That being an eyeless nun that stalks the halls. And this is the setup for our first title, Nun Massacre. Nun Massacre is a first-person survival horror game developed by Puppet Combo and released in 2018. Puppet Combo is an indie dev who is most known for their horror titles. Their titles have the double whammy of retro PS1 or 90s PC blocky 3D graphics, as well as inspired by 80s slasher films. Nun Massacre even coming with a heavy VHS overlay, making the game feel somewhere between cursed VHS you'd find from Blockbuster and a cursed PlayStation game you might find at that same Blockbuster. Nun Massacre really hits the perfect point between these two artistic inspirations to create a specific art style that I can't help but love. Nun Massacre plays like many horror games after the wake of amnesia. You walk around a dark, spooky environment, searching each drawer individually, solving puzzles, hiding under beds from the big spooky monster. In other words, the game plays like Twitch streamer bait. And saying that is kind of an insult to Nun Massacre, but it's probably one of the best games in that subgenre of horror title. One way Nun Massacre switches it up is its very limited inventory system. Your character can only hold 3 items at a time, so choosing what to carry on you is extremely important. Do you decide to carry the radar and the lighter? The radar always telling you the nun's relative location to you, and the lighter letting you see in these dark halls. Do you grab neither or only one of them, and leave the 2 other spots open for puzzle items? Do you pick up a rock and use it to distract the nun? Or even possibly the gun, to make her feel like the prey for once? These small, little decisions really helping make this game feel all the more tense. And don't get me started on the nun. Having an immortal stalker is nothing new in horror games, but she be hittin' different. She goes around with the typical way of hunting with sight and sound, you making loud noises and running around, she'll usually come and investigate. And if you have the lighter on in front of her, she'll spot you from a mile away. But I've never seen one of these enemies just lay in wait like she does. On more than one occasion have I walked past a room with her sitting in there just waiting to jump out at me. I don't recall ever being ambushed like this by any other stalker enemy. It's a random jump scare that actually helps the game. And there's other scenarios and maps that you get after beating the game. Nun Massacre was honestly the biggest surprise out of the 3. Retro aesthetics like this are kind of par for the course, but this one kind of captured the whole spirit of the game very perfectly. The gameplay isn't revolutionary by any means, but it nails what it does to a T. And to top it all off, the game only costs $6. It's about the price of a Starbucks coffee, so it's a pretty good value in my book. If you like horror, especially 80s slasher films, this game is for you. Play it with the developer instructions if you dare, and you'll have a horror experience you won't soon forget. This may be a little known fact, but I'm a big fan of Japanese media. I do love me character action games, a good JRPG, and even the odd Japanese film or occasional Japanimation from time to time. So seeing our next title, Quieton, Azuma Manor's story, on the Nintendo eShop piqued my interest. The name Quieton may ring a bell if you're into Japanese cinema. There's a 1964 film by the name Quieton, and the movie is often touted as a classic. I think these devs must have some confidence in their game if they're attempting to put it up next to a classic like that. So why don't we see if their confidence is well placed? Quieton, Azuma Manor's Story is another 2018 horror release developed by the Japanese independent studio Quieton? I probably pronounced that wrong. And is currently the studio's only released game. They do have another title in development, Incline, Railway of Devil's Valley. And according to the dev's website, they claim that Quieton was in development for 9 years. This game kinda has a PS2 or Dreamcast aesthetic, some chunkier 3D models with a slight cel shading, just to add a little spice to the look, I guess. To be fair, I'm kind of a mark for these retro aesthetics, but I honestly didn't really jive with the look of Quieton. Something about it just felt off. It didn't feel like it was an aesthetic they were going for, just an aesthetic they settled with. Kinda like it was a D-tier title on the PS2 that was looking up at Onimusha and Resident Evil and just didn't have the talent or budget to get there. It's sad that the game's look harkens back to older PlayStation titles that have similar looks and vibes, but all of its inspirations look better than it. But you know what, who knows, maybe the gameplay will help sell it. The visual comparisons to Onimusha isn't where it's gonna end. Quieton is a fairly action-heavy title in an old-school Japanese aesthetic like Onimusha. The biggest difference is Quieton feels really bad to play. The combat is slow and clunky and has infinitely respawning enemies. And honestly, having bad combat in a horror game isn't the biggest sin. It can often add tension and make you consider whether or not to engage with an enemy, but have constantly respawning monsters and having a mana system that makes you block enemies just to use attacks that can hit high or low enemies makes it feel like the devs wanted it to be the centerpiece of the title, and it feels really, really bad to play. None of the attacks feel good to use at all. At least Onimusha feels pretty good to play for the most part and has some weight and speed behind its attacks. The creatures are cool, but they're just the typical Japanese yokai affair. And if I wanted to play an action-heavy game where you kill yokai, I might as well boot up Nioh instead. Honestly, the gameplay is probably the worst part about the whole experience. The final nail in the game's coffin is gotta be its price point. The game is the most expensive out of the 3 titles in this video, at the price of $25. While looking the flattest and playing the worst. I really don't like railing against games, especially smaller indie titles, but this one's just not it, man. I would recommend you avoid this game, or at least wait for a very, very deep sale if you still want to play it despite everything I've said here. But I'd rather boot up the Onimusha remaster if I wanted a feudal Japan romp. Do you like fast-paced first-person shooters? Do you like horror movies? Do you long for the days where FPS games are called Doom clones? Well, the indie space has you covered, with the whole boomer shooter revival, and now the old school games like Doom and Quake are back in fashion, and honestly I dig it. We've had revivals of studios like 3D Realms, making what they're best known for. But there's been a new kid on the block, a publisher thriving on the whole new boomer shooter revival, that being New Blood Interactive, and probably their best known title, Dusk. Dusk was developed by David Zemansky, who is most known for this title, but has also released a small horror title, Iron Lung, in 2022, as well as directing the game Gloomwood, a more stealth-focused shooter. Dusk being the first game Zemansky has directed. It was even a smash hit in its early access days, and making its full release on Steam in 2018, and then got a Switch port in 2021. That Switch port being what I played for this video. Similarly to the other titles I discussed in this video, Dusk also has a retro aesthetic with blocky 3D graphics and some chunky polygons, specifically harkening back to the days of Quake, and Dusk really nails the look. I really like the escalation of the game's look as well, early on just being a pretty good Quake clone, shooting rednecks and chainsaws, demon goats and cultists, in a rural setting. The further you go along, you start to realize this game is doing a lot more than Quake could ever accomplish, with massive sprawling levels, tons of enemies on screen, and set pieces that would probably blow up your 90s PC. You go from backwoods to military complexes and ghost towns, to ancient catacombs and eldritch cathedrals, each episode having special enemies to fit their locales, all adding to the very specific horror vibes that each one has. The gameplay is definitely the main draw of this title. All the guns sound hefty and powerful, and hit just as hard as they sound. The gunplay feels amazing, fast and reactive, You get your typical boomer shooter gun lineup. Pistols, shotgun, super shotgun, machine gun, sniper rifle. You get a grenade and rocket launcher in the form of the mortar and rivet gun, and a crossbow that can shoot through enemies and walls. Like I said, the basic boomer shooter lineup. There's not a weak one in the bunch, to be honest with you. The shotguns have heavy booms, the machine gun sounds like an M60, and each gun feels like they have a role in combat. My only complaint when it comes to the weapons is that there isn't a BFG type weapon, a super weapon that clears the screen, but the fact is everything that's there feels amazing to use, so that complaint is really just a nitpick. The entire flow and feel of the combat is spectacular, and that's the only thing I could find to complain about. This game definitely gets a thumbs up from me. It's probably one of the best titles in that modern retro shooter trend, and Zemansky and Nooblood have been producing some pretty great titles, and this one has me itching to play both Iron Lung and Gloomwood. And the game is on the pricier side for an indie title at $20, but I'd definitely say it's worth it, so pick it up when you get the chance. Well, I hope this showcase didn't spook y'all too much. And thank you for dropping by the Indie Roundup. This rodeo was definitely a fun one. Hope to be seeing y'all again soon. And if you don't want to miss another one of these here videos, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Thank y'all once again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.